Unsettling true stories. This is Otto Warmbier. Otto was a college student at the University of Virginia and he loved to travel. One day in 2015, Otto heard about a group that was taking students to visit North Korea. Being the adventure seeker that Otto was, he really wanted to go and visit the mysterious country that not many people have seen. It took some convincing, but his parents eventually agreed to let him go. When Otto and his group of students got to North Korea, things felt a little off at first, but eventually they settled in and began to enjoy their stay. Nothing strange happened until the last day of the trip. As Otto showed airport security his passport to go home, he was immediately arrested. North Korean officials said that he was seen on his hotel security camera stealing a painting, which is a very severe crime. His group left and Otto remained in jail. Eventually Otto confessed to his crime. Many people think that it was a forced confession, because as soon as he was done addressing the court, he burst into tears and begged for forgiveness. Part 2 is up now. Unsettling true stories. After his supposed confession, they took Otto away. The whole thing was really suspicious, considering that the footage that they used as evidence against Otto didn't even look like him. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, and nobody heard from him until a year and a half later. The US government had been trying to free Otto since the moment he was locked away, and in June 2017 he was finally let go. His family and friends hadn't seen Otto in over a year, and when he got off the plane, things were not right. Otto was in a coma, and his family barely recognized him. He had new scars all over his body and his teeth were messed up. They brought him to a hospital and Otto was put on life support. Unfortunately, he had suffered severe brain damage from something. And just 6 days after he had landed, his family accepted that he was never coming back. On June 19th, he passed away. And to this day, North Korea denies harming Otto in any way.
If you ever see this man outside, you better make a run for it. One day, a little girl received a text message from her friend late at night. Her friend told her to sneak outside to the nearby park to hang out with her. She told her that it would be like an adventure and that she had to sneak out no matter what. So not knowing better, this little girl snuck outside of her house without her parents knowing. She eventually made it to the bench outside, but no one was there. So she decided to call her friend on her phone and ask her where she was. The friend picked up the phone and told her that she'd never called her to the park. She said, "That wasn't my number that texted you." Now getting a little scared, the girl decided to call police and tell them what happened. And upon hearing the story, police immediately told her to run back home as soon as possible. They told her that another girl had called with the same exact story just 1 week earlier, and that if she didn't run back right now, she would be in big trouble. Right after hearing that, the girl decided to run back home as soon as she could. But just as she left, she heard someone right behind her. Not wanting to turn back, the girl quickly sprinted as fast as she could, and the footsteps behind her got louder and louder. And just at that moment, she turned around to see who it was. Follow for part 2. If you ever see this man outside, you better make a run for it, part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, go watch my latest video. Anyways, on with the story. Now getting super scared, the girl decided to make a run for it, but just then she turned back to see who it was. And thankfully, it was the police officers who were chasing her to tell her that she was okay. Now breathing a sigh of relief, she immediately stopped where she was and told the officers that she was super scared. They told her not to worry at all and that she had called just in the right time. They then told her that another girl had called them just a week earlier with the same story. A friend had texted her to come to the park, but this number wasn't actually her friend. You see, this number was from a maniac killer who tried to stalk little girls. He texted them telling them to come to the park and then he would kidnap them. Upon realizing this, the girl was super scared, but she was so happy that the police had came. But just at that moment, one of the police officers turned around to hear someone coming, and then someone snatched the girl away. And you won't believe what happens next. Part 3 is on an inclusive app called Bigo Live. It's the perfect app for live streaming and meeting new people. Click the link in my bio to download now.
This is the story of a 5-year-old Canadian girl who vanished back in 2004. Her name is Tamara Keepness, and she disappeared from her home in Regina, Saskatchewan. On the evening of July 5th, 2004, Tamara's mom, Lorena, and her partner, Dean, had gotten into a fight. This prompted Dean to leave, and he ran into his friend, Russell, who was a family friend and also his roommate. Lorena put her 6 children to bed and then left to go have a drink with a friend down the street, leaving her eldest daughter, 11-year-old Summer, in charge. Later that night, Lorena had left her friend's house to go to the liquor store to pick up more booze. On her way back from this liquor store to her friend's house, she stopped by her house to check on the kids. Everything seemed fine, and she told Summer to make sure all the doors were locked and to not answer the door for anybody. Lorena then left, and she would never see Tamara ever again. Stay tuned for part 2. The disappearance of Tamara Keepness, part 2. At 2 a.m., Russell Sheepskin, that family friend that Dean had gone drinking with, came back to the house. He wanted to check on the children and had lost Dean at some point during that night and could not find him. He claimed that when he entered the house, he saw Tamara sleeping on the love seat. Russell then headed to the porch to smoke a cigarette, and then Dean had actually shown up and come home. Now these two got in a fist fight, like a really brutal fight, but Russell claims that it wasn't loud enough that the kids could have heard. I could not find anything about what they were fighting about, but clearly it was something serious. Dean then left to go sleep at his aunt's house, and he arrived there around 5:30 a.m. Now the reason it took so long is because he kept passing out because he was so drunk. Russell then went to the hospital to go get himself some stitches. He said he went out the back door but didn't lock it on the way out. And that was the last time that they would ever see Tamara. Stay tuned for part 3. The Disappearance of Tamara Keepness, Part 3. Lorena had returned home around 3:15 to 3:30 a.m., so right after the two guys got in that fight. She crawled through the front window because the front door was still locked. Although she was quite drunk, she does remember seeing her other child, Tanis, and Summer sleeping in the living room when she arrived home, but she does not remember seeing Tamara. Lorena then fell asleep on the couch. Later that morning, Tamara's brother, Rain, was asleep in bed, but he was woken up because he felt the bed move next to him, but he just thought it was Tamara getting up. He didn't know what time it was, but all he knew was that it was light outside. What's interesting is the kid's grandma then showed up at the house, but she found the front door unlocked. It's now 10:30 a.m. and Lorena has prepared breakfast for all the kids, but Tamara didn't show up. She sent one of the kids upstairs to go and grab her, but they came back and said Tamara wasn't there. Stay tuned for part 4. The Disappearance of Tamara Keepness, Part 4. After realizing Tamara was missing, the family went off and did their own search, but were unsuccessful. The family then called the police, and Tamara was officially reported as a missing person at 12:15 p.m. Thus began the largest search in Regina's history. Tamara is still missing to this day. It's important to note that Tamara's mom, Lorena, admitted that she has not made the best life choices. She's a residential school survivor, and she grew up in a very abusive household. There is so much more to this story and so many theories, and I'm gonna do a podcast episode on it soon.
This is one of the biggest plot twists to ever occur in real life. Nicholas Barclay vanished from a basketball game near his house in 1994. For 3 whole years, they searched and searched but could never find him. But then one day, he showed up after 3 years. Everybody in the family was extremely excited to see him, and they had a huge family reunion. But something was off about Nicholas. It was so off that everyone began to take notice after time. And here's what it was. When Nicholas had disappeared, he had blonde hair and bright blue eyes. But when he finally showed up 3 years later, both his blonde hair and blue eyes were gone and were instead replaced by brown eyes and brown hair. And the weirdest part was he had a French accent. I mean, it was totally possible that he had went to France for 3 years and came back. But something was just really off about Nicholas. When finally asked about it, he said that his hair had been dyed and chemicals had caused his eyes to turn brown. He also stated that he lived in Europe, which changed his accent. And obviously the family believed him and let him stay in the house for 6 months. But then one day the FBI took samples of his hair and blood, and what they found shocked the entire family. Follow for part 2. This is the story of the most mysterious man to ever live. In 1954, a businessman arrived in the Tokyo airport for a meeting. When asked to show his passport, he showed them this one. Initially, it looked legit. It had stamps and pretty much everything that all passports have. But when taking a closer look at, it said that the passport was issued in a country named Torrid. But there was no such country. Officials started becoming suspicious of this man and called Tokyo officers to investigate. The officers asked the man to point to the country named Torrid. He then proceeded to point to a tiny country between Spain and France. But the officers quickly realized that this was not Torrid. In fact, he pointed to the country called Andorra. After the officers told him that he had in fact pointed to Andorra, he got very upset and said that Torrid had existed for over 1,000 years. So quickly, just like anyone else would, they called up the hotel where the man claimed to stay. But they claimed that there was no man under that name registered there. So thinking this man was a fraud, they detained the man in a hotel. He was kept in a room that was very, very high up with no balcony at all. But then something very mysterious occurred. Follow for part 2. This is the story of the most mysterious man to ever live, part 2. For those of you who haven't seen part 1, go watch the video before this one. Alright, on with the story. The next morning, when officials came to check up on the mysterious man in his hotel room, there was absolutely no trace of him whatsoever. Though they started looking for him everywhere, nobody ever found him again. Over the years, many people tried to understand what happened to the man, but no one figured it out. And now there's even books and movies about him. But the two possible solutions for this mystery are as follows. Number 1, this man came from a parallel dimension or the future. Though it may not sound likely at first, what better solution can you think of? Maybe point number 2, which is that this whole theory was just made up. Some people do argue that this whole story was just made up for entertainment, and this does seem very likely. In fact, other than videos and theories from random people, there are barely any scientific articles that state that this man disappeared in the past. Anyways, what do you guys think? Comment down below your own theories. And as always, follow me for more cool stories.